Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to U.S. History Through Film, as we begin to look at the Revolutionary War in the South through selections from a number of documentaries and other films. Now, while the early battles of the war were mostly fought in the North, there were a few important battles in the South early, and the focus of the war would turn to the South in the late 1770s. Indeed, one day after the battles of Lexington and Concord, which is to say on April 20th, 1775, Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, also tried to seize control of the local gunpowder supplies, in this case those in Williamsburg, Virginia. Local people again sounded the alarm, and the militia, some led by Patrick Henry, surrounded Williamsburg. Lord Dunmore further infuriated Virginians by offering freedom to any slave who would fight for the British, and he threatened to have the Navy bombard Yorktown and burn Williamsburg to ashes if he was personally attacked. Eventually, though, he did flee Virginia and tried to govern the colony from a ship of the Royal Navy off the coast. And about a year later, on June 28, 1776, Sir Henry Clinton, who's been in America for some time but not yet in overall command as he would be later, he led an attack on Charleston, South Carolina. Charleston's defense was led by William Moultrie, who built a fort out of palmetto trees, fresh-cut palmetto trees with sand packed between the logs, on Sullivan's Island in Charleston Harbor. It is sometimes known as the Battle of Sullivan's Island or the First Battle of Charleston, where those green, freshly cut palmetto logs, instead of shattering when British cannonballs hit them, instead just sunk in a bit and the cannonballs bounced off. One of the great moments in the history of South Carolina, which is commemorated on the state flag today, which has the crescent moon, which was a symbol of Sullivan's men, and the palmetto tree, which defended Charleston Harbor so successfully in 1776. Also in 1776, the British decided to enforce some of the rules of the Proclamation Line, created by the Proclamation of 1763, which had attempted to ban most settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. And yet such settlement had taken place. In what is now East Tennessee, for example, settlement had begun on some scale as early as 1770, possibly 1769, and being outside the authority of any British colony, the people there had eventually created their own government, which they called the Watauga Association, along the Watauga and Nolichucky rivers. Again, governed themselves. According to Theodore Roosevelt, this made them the first truly independent government created on the American continent. According to Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, this made them a dangerous example to the rest of America. But in 1776, the British decided to destroy this little government, this little association, and encouraged American Indians, led by warriors such as Dragging Canoe, who had resented older Cherokee leaders' willingness to lease land to the Watauga settlers, and they prepared to attack the settlements of Watauga. The Wataugans defended themselves by building forts in modern-day Bluff City, modern-day Elizabethton, where the fort was known as Fort Caswell, after the governor of North Carolina. Indeed, the Wataugans at this point petitioned to become part of the brand new state of North Carolina and were recognized as the Washington District, which later developed into Washington County, Tennessee, and a number of other surrounding counties, making Washington County, Tennessee, the first place on earth named for George Washington. The two forts that were built defended themselves successfully. A third was destroyed while still being constructed, and there were also successful counterattacks against the Cherokee on the Long Island of the Holston River in modern-day Kingsport. So these attacks were stopped in 1776. And of course, after Burgoyne's surrender at Saratoga and Clinton's retreat from Philadelphia in 1777 and 1778, the British began to concentrate on the South. It was felt that the South had more loyalists, people who would support the British government if the British Army would just move into the area to back up the Loyalists. Indeed, in the Revolutionary War as a whole, and especially in the South, the war would have something of the character of a civil war, as patriots fought against Loyalists for independence or for membership in a great empire, and also sometimes to settle old scores in the name of fighting the Revolution, fighting one side or the other. December 29th, 1778, a British force of about 3,500 troops was sent from New York by Henry Clinton and managed to capture the city of Savannah, by far the largest of the few settlements in Georgia. And although American and French forces tried to retake Savannah, they accomplished nothing except losing significant casualties. And pretty soon, most American forces had abandoned Georgia, and it would remain a loyalist stronghold till the end of the war. Those forces who abandoned Georgia largely moved into Charleston, South Carolina, which, in April of 1780, General Clinton laid siege to, Charleston being under the command of General Benjamin Lincoln. And after a month of siege, General Lincoln was forced to surrender with over 5,000 men. The worst defeat of the war for America, the largest surrender of American forces until the surrender of the defenders of the Bataan Peninsula to the Japanese in 1942. And many of those men who surrendered in Charleston were loaded onto prison ships. This was a particularly infamous prison ship in New York Harbor, but there were many in Charleston Harbor too. These were old British ships, warships and merchant ships, mostly warships, so old they weren't fit to sail on the high seas anymore, and prisoners were trapped in these rotting hulks. It's estimated as many as 3/4 may have died. Among those who died on the prison ships of Charleston was the mother of a young man named Andrew Jackson. His mother had gone there to try to tend the sick and wounded American prisoners of war, but died of disease herself. One of many reasons Andrew Jackson would always hate the British. And after the fall of Savannah and Charleston, Southern Loyalists, as I've already mentioned, fought back even more boldly against the revolutionaries, again effectively creating a civil war in the South. One famous or infamous unit of Americans fighting for the British was led by a British officer, Banastre Tarleton, a group known as the American Legion, or sometimes the Green Jackets, after the distinctive green jackets these dragoons wore. Dragoons being men trained to fight on horseback or get off their horses and fight on foot. And on May 29th, 1780, Banastre Tarleton led his men against American forces at a place called the Waxhaws, on the border between North and South Carolina, indeed close to the birthplace of Andrew Jackson. Here, there were about 400 Americans under Colonel Abraham Buford, facing about 270 British and Loyalist dragoons, mostly American Loyalists, under Tarleton. Tarleton asked Buford to surrender, and at first he refused. Tarleton's forces then attacked and began to overwhelm the Americans, and what happened then is unclear. Buford apparently did try to surrender, but while he was waving the white flag, his horse was shot. Whether it was an accidental shot or a deliberate hit, we don't know. Some Americans felt that their attempt to surrender had been rejected, and they began to fight again. The British thought the Americans had surrendered and were now fighting again, which was kind of cheating, and they began to attack indiscriminately. When men continued to try to surrender, some were hacked down with swords. Even men kneeling with their hands over their heads were slaughtered in what came to be known as the Waxhaws Massacre. Almost the entire American force was killed or captured. Tarleton won a reputation for being a butcher. And when some British soldiers later tried to surrender in other battles, they in turn were massacred. and Americans shouted Tarleton's quarter, quarter being a term meaning mercy. And so, because most of the Loyalists and Patriots in Georgia and South Carolina were not organized as part of a regular army, some of them turned to guerrilla warfare. One of the most famous of these guerrilla leaders was Francis Marion. In his youth, he had been a sailor in the Caribbean until his schooner was sunk after crashing into a whale. He had fought against the Cherokee in the French and Indian War. He got a commission in the Continental Army in 1776. He only escaped being captured at the surrender of Charleston in 1780 because he was at home recuperating with a broken ankle. When he did recover, he gathered what militia he could, launched a guerrilla war against the British, attacking small groups of soldiers, capturing supplies, vanishing into the woods and swamps of South Carolina, where the British could not find him. Tarleton was among the officers told to hunt him down, but had so little luck, he supposedly said, as for this damned old fox, the devil himself could not catch him. And Francis Marion was known afterwards as the Swamp Fox. Now, having captured two of the major port cities in the South, General Clinton returned to New York and left General Charles Cornwallis in charge of British forces in the Carolinas. And he moved against General Horatio Gates, who was now in command of American forces in the South, Washington still sitting outside New York City. The two men fought on August 16, 1780, at an important crossroads in Camden, South Carolina. Cornwallis had about 2,100 men. Gates had over 4,000. But disease had left most of Gates's men, or quite a few of Gates's men, unfit for duty. And of those who were fit for duty, over 2/3 were militia who had never fought in a battle before. Gates put those inexperienced militia in front, with regular infantry and cavalry behind to support them. Gates's untrained militia faced experienced British and Loyalist troops. Many of Gates's men ran without firing a shot. The more experienced American troops behind him were ordered to advance, and there was some confusion as the men moving forward ran into the men running away. Still, some of Gates's men did do quite well, not knowing that many of their comrades were running away. And so some units did so well they pushed forward into British lines, but then ended up trapped when most of the American forces retreated. Eventually, British cavalry were able to get behind and attack the rear of the American forces, forcing Americans to retreat. Tarleton chased retreating Americans for 12 miles before turning back. The Continental Army losing at least 1,000 casualties, killed and wounded, most of their supplies, while the British lost 350 men, killed and wounded. Among the Americans who fled the battle was General Horatio Gates himself, who began to run almost as soon as his militia did. And while all his men ran, aside from those who were captured, Gates really ran, riding to Charlotte, North Carolina, 60 miles away within a few hours, and continuing to go on. By August 19th, he was in Hillsborough, North Carolina, 180 miles away from the battlefield he had fled. And after this embarrassing defeat, Gates was removed from command, although technically left as a general in the army. Washington replaced Gates with his trusted associate, General Nathaniel Greene. And just as Tarleton had been given the task of hunting down the Swamp Fox and other guerrillas, Major Patrick Ferguson was given command of the western wing of Cornwallis's army, made up of well over 1,000 Loyalists, told to protect the rest of the army from any militia on the frontier and to hunt down all the rebels he could in the mountains. Indeed, Ferguson soon planned to lead an attack over the mountains to deal with those men and women who had settled beyond the proclamation line. He sent a message that those people living over the mountains should lay down their weapons and swear loyalty to the king, or Ferguson would march over the mountains, hang the local leaders, and lay the country waste with fire and sword. But instead of surrendering, those men living over the mountains from southwest Virginia, modern East Tennessee, mustered in what's now Elizabethton, Tennessee, at a place called the Sycamore Shoals, to prepare to fight the British. So many men, well over 1,000, volunteered to fight, that some had to be drafted to stay home. Perhaps one of the few times in history when men have had to be drafted out of a war. Being feared that if there weren't some people at home, the Indians or other British forces might attack while they were gone. Because from there, they marched over the mountains, getting the nickname the Overmountain Men, to seek out Cornwallis's forces, Ferguson's forces, which they eventually did at Kings Mountain, on the border of North and South Carolina. Now, this is called a mountain. It's more of a low hill, but in that part of the country, it is about the highest thing around, and Ferguson's men were encamped on top of the mountain. Ferguson swore that God himself could not get him off the mountain. But in about an hour, around 900 frontiersmen defeated his force of about 1,100 loyalists. Ferguson himself was shot and killed and buried on top of the mountain. Indeed, he was not got off the mountain. He is still there. And the creation of the Watauga Association by the settlers across the mountains and their fight against Ferguson at Kings Mountain is one of the segments in a History Channel documentary released in 2008, embarrassingly entitled Hillbilly, The Real Story. Despite the name, it's a pretty good documentary. Looks at some of the sensational and stereotypical topics of Southern Appalachia, like moonshining and snake handling and NASCAR, but also takes on more serious topics like coal mining and TVA, violent strikes in the mountains, and the settlement of what is now Upper East Tennessee and the Battle of Kings Mountain. Parts of that segment were filmed in Elizabethton, Tennessee. Among the people interviewed for the documentary are a professor at East Tennessee State University and a Jonesboro Town Commissioner. And perhaps I should not suggest that snake handling or NASCAR or moonshining are not serious. They're obviously very serious to very many people, but they were topics chosen in part, I think, to make the documentary as exciting as possible.